Welcome, everybody. We're going to get this started here. My name is Matt O'Sullivan, one of the founding members, and I serve on the board of Hub 88. We're very pleased to welcome you to our Tech Talk for October. And I just want to give a very quick introduction to Hub 88. We built the organization on a foundation of innovation, education, and commerce.
Welcome to the October Tech Talk with Hub 88. As you know, October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so we are happy to fuel this awareness and this discussion and continue with this lively panel. My name is Michele Piazza, and I'm the founder and president of MP Global Ventures, which, as Lori described, is a security risk management and privacy advisory firm based out of Naperville, Illinois, and today Bozeman, Montana. I'm also the co-founder of Mountain View Partners, along with my colleague Todd Rowe, who's on the panel today. And we focus on privacy and security for the K through 12 education sector to assist them to become compliant with state regulations and improving their security posture along that journey. I'm very excited to moderate this panel today, as it is a global panel tonight, joining us from Ireland, Canada, and the western suburbs of Chicago. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished panel, and we're going to start with Valerie in Ireland. Go ahead, Valerie.
Do you want me to introduce myself? Sorry, what do you want me to? Oh, sorry, I'm Valerie. I beg your pardon. And my background obviously is privacy, but I also have about 16 years before privacy in security. So I was the CISO in KBC Bank in Ireland. I suppose to the panel, I bring a sense of what's happening in Europe to give that element of sort of global background. I suppose my experience in security and privacy, I call myself the human version of 27701 because I blend the two, 27001 with 27701. So I just hope for today's panel to be able to give everybody a sense of what the transition will look like from 2020 to 2021 from a European perspective, and maybe bring some GDPR into the discussion.
Great, thanks so much. Todd, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, good evening. Thank you. This is great. Thank you, Michele. Michelle's correct. That's a great introduction as far as Michele and I are working on a new venture together. But before I got into this great spot with Michele, I have been an attorney for over 20 years now in Chicago. I've also practiced in Michigan and Wisconsin, and I'm licensed there, and I handle a lot of work in all those states. I am with Tressler LLP in Chicago, currently operating in the remote office of my basement, Tressler's office there, but we do have offices across the country, which helps out. By way of background, I have been a privacy attorney now, I guess, is what I would call myself, for roughly 10 years, which is a long time for law. We in the legal industry were well behind everybody in the tech industry, and we're just catching up. The way I came about it was I was doing a lot of insurance coverage work, and we were seeing a lot of claims come in, and we weren't really sure, this isn't really property damage or bodily injury, something that we would see maybe under a normal commercial liability policy. And we started realizing that there was going to have to be a spot for privacy in insurance coverage, and we got on that. Since that time, I've drafted a number of insurance cyber policies, which has been really good. I've also shifted recently more into handling BIPA claims, which is the Biometric Information Protection Act here in Illinois, sort of handling that biometric data and all the class action litigation that's going on with that. So that's been really good for me to be a part of. And of course now, here in Illinois, we kind of lead the way on a lot of these laws from the state perspective, and we have SOPA, which is School Online Protection Act, and that's really what we're doing is stepping in that space and trying to help school administrators and privacy professionals with that very sensitive data that they have with students. So it's been great. I really look forward to this conversation. and seeing some good questions afterward.
Great. Thanks so much, Todd. Glenn, you're up.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm really happy to be joining Valerie and Todd on the panel with you. I am the Chief Security Officer at Trexin Consulting, which is a management consulting firm based in Minneapolis, a major location in Chicago, and for as long as I'm sitting here in Edmonton, Canada, also the Edmonton office. I guess you'd say I'm the Chief Security Officer. I think I'm the Chief Privacy Officer, unless I'm the Chief Data Officer, because the Chief Technology Officer and I traded. But the point is, we'll get discussing that later about how many different three-letter acronyms it takes to secure the workplace. My roots are technology, 15 years at Bell Labs, which over time morphed into the same Nokia that's supporting Hub 88. I was working on a little-known operating system called Unix. Over time, I guess, people would say, oh, you're in technology. And over time, I guess I would say, no, I'm in people. Technology problems are really people problems. People problems are exhibited and exacerbated by technology problems. So in this discussion, there's data, there's compliance, there's security, there's technology, but there's really people.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. All right, so let's jump in. So COVID-19 has changed our landscape across security and education. And since October is National Cybersecurity Month, and it's important to lead with a security, privacy, and risk mindset during this pandemic, what are each of you seeing in your particular verticals as the key privacy and security challenges facing our remote learners and our remote workers? And then I'm going to tag on and say, okay, what about the schools and the firms that these remote, employees are associated with?
Well, I can handle that. So this is Todd Rowe, and thanks, Michelle, for that great question. I can kind of break it up, I think, from a couple of different perspectives. The schools are really the hot spot for us right now, and they were a hot spot for a while. What we were seeing here in Illinois, and I think across the US, was large-scale breaches. While some of those large-scale breaches from a couple of years ago, maybe involving Home Depot or Target, sort of slowed down, we were seeing large-scale breaches in the ed tech, the educational tech sector, which would be things like Pearson. Pearson, the year before last, had a large breach, and they had a lot of student data. So even before 2020, we were seeing a lot of issues pop up in education and sort of identifying these issues. The value, obviously, with student information is key, because if you have juvenile information, hackers or people that have bad intent can do a lot with that information because they have time before that person hits 18, and goes and gets a mortgage or a student loan. So that's a very high value target, would be student information. And I think that the schools kind of gave way and sort of gave us a glimpse of what everybody's going to be looking at, even in the workplace. And just to jump to that, I think one of the things we've seen, obviously, is what we're doing right now, and just having a lot of meetings through Zoom, and all that sensitive data that used to be, at least in our offices, now needs to be managed. So I think without a doubt, a lot of these issues have come to light. I'm shocked, to be honest, that we haven't seen a real large-scale incident involving, we see these little funny things going on with Zoom or, that type of thing, but I'm actually shocked that we haven't seen anything. So that's kind of a snapshot from my perspective as to where we are in 2020.
I think on the European side, I would say that the biggest breach that we're seeing that's related to the transitioning that we're going through at the moment is most definitely breaches of employment contracts. So the use of surveillance on employees and health surveillance for the purpose of COVID has been made illegal in a lot of jurisdictions across Europe because of the invasion of privacy versus the legitimate needs of the business. Is there no other way? The necessity and purpose principles in GDPR. So we've seen a couple of fines now from a couple of data protection offices across Europe in relation to the overuse of the power of the employer when it comes to enacting health provisions for COVID. They're doing it for all the right reasons, of course, but
Mhm.
they're still breaching laws and doing it because the employee has rights under GDPR, not just under health and safety. And I suppose that's a big difference that we'll see going forward in the discussion, is the difference between how we structure our approach to data protection and security. In the US, it's very siloed. You have student information, you've got patient information, you've got children's information, and all of them are dealt with in silos. Whereas in Europe, we've got personal information or sensitive personal information, and it doesn't matter where that is. So when we talk about students, it's irrelevant. In Europe, it's GDPR. You know, we have a couple of judgments made on top of GDPR that make scripts, the scripts involved in exams, that makes them personal data, but it just makes them qualify under GDPR. So all data qualifies under GDPR. And that makes it simple to deal with, you know, a legislation perspective, but it also makes things complicated. And that's where we've got the fines. So we've big fines now starting in Europe. That's where I see a big change as a result of COVID.
And, you know, this is going to be a great panel, I can already tell, because as I was thinking about what my answers would be, I was going, oh, I hope Todd and Valerie don't say the same thing. And we're taking, I think we're kind of painting a mosaic from some dramatically different points of view about the same situation. For me, I see phishing and ransomware, or probably you all see phishing and ransomware, definitely on an uptick, taking advantage of people's, let's say, slightly more sensitive state of mind. And also related to that is the home environment, which is not just an internet, now a complex web of Internet of Things. Like every TV happens to be Android underneath, and when it starts asking you for a ransom, what you going to do? But also the fact that the people in the home environment are sharing things. I had a client meeting with the security executive, and the client came on as a name I wasn't familiar with. And when I asked that person, I said, well, yeah, I'm borrowing my daughter's iPad because she needed my laptop to get the right access for her school. And so there's the sharing of devices and sharing of permissions. And I wanted to relate to you just real quick story from just this morning. The CISO of a major international law firm put out the call among the CISO professionals in Chicago and said, you know, I just got my son a Chromebook, but you know, for school, and it's great, but how do I actually protect him and us from the fact that he's using this now? Because it's a slightly different operating system the rest of us are used to. And one other very experienced CISO professional said, well, you're not really going to be able to secure that against your son. My own son was banned from sites after 8 p.m. So he installed a keystroke logger on his mom's computer and captured her AOL password and went in and elevated his privileges to 18 plus. And he would have gotten away with it, except he left some evidence on the printer that his sister found and reported it to her mom. So it's like, which I guess means that she deserves a bug bounty for this. But I mean, right. The point is, this gets really complicated. And as Valerie mentioned, there's some real compliance issues, and Todd, real penalties, legal penalties that come from this environment that we don't actually clearly understand right now.
And what about vendors that, you know, each of these constituencies are dealing with, whether it's the school district or the firm, you know, like you said, the refrigerator's going off. I mean, how are they responding to this, you know, inflated set of needs now to create even more layers of security for their customers and their clients or their students?
Well, I'll slip in a really quick response and then sit back for the others to chime in, because when that TV was turned on and had a ransomware notice, and this was 2 years ago, the vendor was absolutely, utterly unequipped to handle it. Now, medical equipment manufacturers are getting on board and making some progress. Those other, your coffee maker manufacturers now know what to do. We are making progress on a technical front, and that's why I wanted to just give the technical answer and let some others talk about the rest of this.
One of the things that we try to do is always cut down liability for our clients, obviously, and the use of data has the potential for a lot of liability. And when it's really frustrating because when our clients entrust data or information to vendors, they lose that control over the data, and then in turn, they increase their liability without having the control. So it's extremely, really difficult for us, especially as we start to see more of our clients, more of our workplaces and schools start to go online and use different types of applications. Those applications are powered by giving data. And if a parent or if a customer or a client entrusted you with that data, you have that fiduciary responsibility to the data. But if you give it to a vendor and they don't know who that vendor is, it's going to be a real problem. And then on top of that, the vendors, we have found, if they have a breach or some sort of incident, they're not very responsive for us to be able to get information out, which is important because then we have that person that we have that fiduciary responsibility to, parent or a customer, wondering what's going on with the data, and we can't answer the questions. So it's very frustrating for us right now with vendors and having more data go. And we are trying to get clients to think about what you're giving to vendors so that you can use whatever that application is, whatever you're using. But it's really been tough. So.
And I suppose, again, the different perspective is how is that managed? In Europe, we have that exact same experience in Europe. But what GDPR does is it says when you have that responsibility, you can't actually let it go. So even if you do pass data out to third parties, such as vendors or data processors, you're still accountable for it. So you're actually not letting go. So in the past where you did lose control of the information, you actually have an obligation now not to lose control of the information. So you have to make sure that you have contracts in place that say the vendor is going to use the data in a way that is compliant with GDPR and that they're going to meet their obligations under GDPR because they too have obligations under GDPR. But kind of the wash hands of the data of the past where you used to kind of pass it out and say, there you go, it's all done and dusted. That can't happen anymore. I mean, it does. Obviously, there are going to be breaches and obviously organizations are going to breach those requirements, but it is addressed structurally in principle by virtue of data processes and third parties having to have agreements in place. So that's how it's addressed in GDPR.
Can you just expand upon what GDPR means for our audience?
So GDPR is a data protection regulation. So we call it data protection, where you guys typically in the US refer to it as privacy, although you do also refer to it as data protection. But privacy we keep for our constitutional rights, really, and that's what we refer to as privacy. So data protection, so it's the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is a pan-European piece of legislation that applies a consistent framework for privacy across 28, soon to be 27 European states. So it essentially is harmonizing privacy law across our states. So the equivalent would be if you guys had a federal privacy law in the states, it would be the same thing as GDPR, but you would probably call it the Federal Privacy Act or something like that, where we call it the General Data Protection Regulation.
So the beginning of that for us was like California doing CCPA in their own minuscule or myopic way. Okay, got it.
And CCPA together with, they have another privacy law as well. When you bring those two together, they kind of look like GDPR. CCPA doesn't have all that GDPR has, but CCPA has some really cool things like a do not sell my data button. That's a really dinky, trust increasing, relationship enhancing with the consumer kind of thing, but we don't have that.
Oh, okay.
But also fundamentally CCPA, and I'm kind of jealous of GDPR. I wish we had that here. It might make our lives easier sometimes, could make it more difficult, but that may just apply to the data that belongs to California residents. So as we sit here-
It does at the moment.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
So that's the exact problem that we have in the US. You know, here we are in Illinois, and if you are a data collector, whether you might have an employee who works at your facility in Illinois, but lives in Wisconsin or lives in Indiana. So we've actually, you know, in our privacy group had to create a 50-state survey of all the different privacy laws, and they're very different from state to state. So that's the exact issue that we have right now. And then you have federal regulations coming in, and that may control a subset of data as well. And then we might have industry regulations coming in. So it's very difficult for us to tell our clients what's going on when we have all these different things overlapping. So.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very complicated. And bearing in mind that in Europe, we had multiple data protection acts before GDPR. So every country had its own data protection act, and they were all vastly different. So all GDPR did was it harmonized all of those data protection acts and made a baseline. So you can have, and Germany, for instance, does have more than GDPR. Spain also has more than GDPR. So you can have more than GDPR, you just can't fall below it.
Okay.
And so that's essentially what it did, was it built the baseline. And
what I think is interesting, if you just kind of roll back and listen to the last 3 or 4 minutes of conversation, is, you know, security used to be about pen tests and attacks and bringing down systems. And if you think about it now, very truly, we've changed to, it's about the data. It's about the data. It's about the data. And I think as we progress in this conversation, we're going to see, you know, in this much more complicated, distributed cloud-y world, that you have to focus down, and you can't solve everything. You can't protect against everything. And data is one of the cornerstones of what we have to keep in mind.
And thanks for that lead into my next question, Glenn. So security and privacy is all about the data and about managing risk, right? So it's about protecting identity, which is the new perimeter, your devices, your application systems, your networks, and most of all, the data. So looking at these pillars, where are you seeing as we roll now into 2021 and hopefully transitioning some level of normalcy back to the office, back into classrooms? What are the most important things for the remote worker and the remote learner and their constituents to be addressing?
I suppose I'll take that on the risk-based element, because GDPR advocates for a risk-based approach to privacy protection. So that is the risks to the data protection rights of the data subject. We have 8 rights, and then the obligations on organizations towards the data protection principles. And that's essentially privacy by design and by default.
Right.
Because GDPR is agnostic to technology, it doesn't matter if the data is on the PC or if it's on a Fitbit, or if it's on a device or if it's on a server. It actually doesn't matter where the data is. There's a series of different requirements for data. So it's always about the data rather than the devices. So really the big piece there is the data subject rights and the organization's obligations under GDPR. That's what matters. If I look into 2021, where do I see those pieces? So the data, the data subject rights, having access, having the right to be deleted, having the right to be forgotten, having the right to have my data changed, these are all my rights. So having those rights, where COVID is a big one, because of the reason that I explained earlier. As an employee, I'm vulnerable. There's a power imbalance between the employer and the employee. GDPR doesn't like power imbalances, and so it qualifies employees as vulnerable individuals. So they have to be treated with kid gloves, as do their data. And we see the need for employers to get access to health data, which is sensitive information. So that's a really complex area. And when employers start to go into monitoring their employees' health, we've seen a lot of cases where they take a step too far. I think also on data, and I think we're probably all aware of this, is data transfers. So we've got Brexit coming up, which means that essentially the UK will be out of Europe come the end of December 2020. And then we have Schrems 2, which essentially has made the privacy shield no longer sustainable. It was expected, to be honest, that that was going to happen anyway, because of surveillance laws in the US and the lack of recourse that the data subject has in the US to make changes or to request that their data isn't processed in a particular way. So they can't do that. So I think that, you know, the data governance element is the kind of the big problem in 2021. And so an organization in 2021 will have to ask, what mechanisms do you have in place to identify those risks? You know, so I think it's probably similar on the security side, and Glenn can kick in on the security side much more so than me, but it's to really know, you know, what mechanisms do we have in place to identify risks to the data subject, to their rights, and to the risk of the organization not meeting their obligations under data protection, GDPR's data protection requirements.
So I think that actually is a great lead in, Valerie. It is all about risk, and not just eliminating the risk, but mitigating it and managing it. You gave a lot of context around privacy and data. And I guess the point is, privacy is not the same as security. Privacy, but data is kind of a common to both of them. So the security mantra, to kind of round out some of the other dimensions, is about the confidentiality and the integrity and the availability of not just the data, but the processing or manipulation of the data and the identification and access to that data. So data is still central to that world, but privacy is related to the confidentiality. Security also needs to pay attention to, you know, are the systems up and running and actually operating as advertised and not leaking the data, you know, right person, right, the minimum amount of data, the minimum amount of people for the minimum amount of time. Now, that really means that, I think, Michelle, you used the term, the identity, which is the new border. And that's worth pausing on for a second. You know, 1,000 years ago, a fort with a castle with very high walls and a moat around it was secure. Damn, was it secure. And if you had to, you know, you either brought in overwhelming force or you sneaked in through the midden gate in the kitchen, or you bribed somebody. Funny how those mechanisms really haven't changed over time. But anyway, then you needed to, the point is you close that moat and you're isolated, and the merchants required and you had to have the border, the perimeter-based security model simply did not work. Well, the same thing happened here. When we all spread with the pandemic to distributed home environments, some people were already doing it anyway. Trexin was a complete bring your own device in the cloud company, but not everybody was, and almost none of our clients were. Now we've blown the doors off of the perimeter-based security. So what do you do now? Well, Michelle, you said identity is the new perimeter. Valerie, you implied sort of the privacy controls around data represents a perimeter. I would posit that actually it's both. Applying information security to what we're talking about here is that, well, frankly, whether it's GDPR or it's NIST or any other collection of alphabet soup, it's really understanding the identity of the person, the privileges that pertain to that person, and protection of data. You need all three of those dimensions. In fact, now, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, I think, Google put this forward as Beyond Corp. Imagine a corporation, they said, where the innermost systems were wide open to the internet and had no security. What does that really mean? And they came up with those principles. Brutal control of the endpoints, identity, roles, the privileges attached to that identity, and the data. More recently, there's a buzzword called zero trust. Same thing. Mm-hmm. The only thing I would add to this, and it'll come up later, it's not just the person that's coming in and the identity. It's really, what are they doing at any point in time? Because people shift roles all the time. A doctor who's a provider might also be a patient. So you have to, it gets tricky in the details.
Really quick, I'm not super proud of this, but here I am, a lawyer, and I'm going to suggest the cheapest, most economical way to deal with the problem. But one of the things that we have been really trying to push is just old school staff training. One of the things that we see a lot of is the bells and whistles are great from the tech side. And am I not a tech person and am I angry about that? Yeah, perhaps maybe that's why I'm going this route as far as attacking the tech folks. But going and just staff training, and really when you think about 2020 and when we sent our workforce home, what would that have looked like, you know, for those companies that actually had good staff training, showing people, hey, here's what a bad email looks like, and really taking a nice approach, not just from the tech side of things, but everybody who's handling the data or working. And I think some of those companies that actually took that time to do the staff training and then released everybody home, you know, in March of this year or whenever, they're going to really reap those rewards. So I'm hoping that when we get into 2021, we start to see more of an emphasis on training that staff and realizing, you know, that the boots on the ground are really the people who are going to see those red flags, who will look at the emails and, you know, maybe their training is very limited. But, you know, at a law firm, maybe it's a paralegal, maybe it's, you can't teach lawyers anything, so we'll skip them. But maybe it's, you know, staff, and they'll look at that email and they'll say, that doesn't look right, I'm going to forward that on. And then knowing the procedure that they need to take to forward that on. So it does get the attention that it needs from our very capable tech people. So I think we're going to see staff training really take a precedence and everything. And it has to complement the technical safeguards that we're putting in place.
I agree. And, you know, even thinking about, you know, as I went through devices, applications, there was a question that came into the chat and they're like, what about the microphones going off in the congressional hearing, you know, for the Supreme Court justice today? You know, are those mics being hacked? You know, where's the control?
Well, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't really out to get you.
But when your refrigerator does start talking to you and demanding ransomware, then you know. So Valerie, you touched on the privacy and secure from the privacy and security lens, the privacy shield going away. Was there anything else that you're seeing as options or solutions from these firms that need to transfer this data now? And is there an impact to remote workers because they're the people that are actually, you know, the boots on the ground during these transfers?
It's a great question. So is there an answer? No, there isn't. So there isn't a great answer at the moment. The one thing that you can do, so what GDPR advocates is this risk-based approach. So the one thing you can do is see what is the risk. So in other words, you know, do I have 50,000 health records being transferred to the US? Well, now you're talking about a high risk to data subjects' rights. But if I have 50,000 low risk records being transferred across, I'm at least able to say that I ascertained the risk. So I'm 60% of the way towards compliance. I haven't done anything about the risk because I actually can't fix the problem, but I have ascertained the risk and I've said I'm going to accept it. And that's an acceptable thing to do. You can accept a risk under GDPR. You just have to be willing to take a fine if the Data Protection Commissioner doesn't agree. So that's the first piece and most important piece, is a risk assessment. And then it's to look at technologies, like one of the key ones that can be used, and they're trying to really extend this, is the use of encryption. It's not applicable for everything. You can't just whizzy up encryption for everything. And so there's many platforms where encryption just simply doesn't work. But where it's possible, you can implement encryption and it can be used. You can accept the risk and you can get it accepted at committee level, which at least is the cover your ass element, if you can get it approved at committee level. But that's pretty much it, until such time as we either have a change in US surveillance laws or a change in the GDPR. The two just can't marry. But I certainly advocate to all our clients that they must do a risk assessment. And that would be a data protection impact assessment, as in under GDPR's DPIA. So it's a specific type of privacy impact assessment that's required under GDPR, and they must undertake that.
I think that's really well put, Valerie. I would extend that. I don't want to use the word challenge. That yeah, you can encrypt anything. I know there are, but the important thing is say that. Take the premise first that you can encrypt everything, and then deal with the exceptions, and that gives you a better risk profile. Because then you're only accepting the risk where you can. And this is where cloud, for instance, is a real opportunity, because the major purveyors, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, handle that to varying degrees, but largely compliant with the government standards. And you don't have to see it. Then you have to just pay attention to the transmission of it, just transmission and the handling locally. But it takes you a good part of the way directly. Now, I also, for data classification, which is in the industry, is a big bugaboo, because it's cumbersome, it's inconvenient, it's largely subverted, it's out of date. And right now I'm experimenting within Trexin, saying that everything's encrypted, everything's confidential, and then there's a level of crown jewels, which is, okay with GDPR as well. So I'm not even talking about data classifications. It's either, ultra secret, or it's just everything else is under, best cost-effective tools, I guess. There's a lot more details behind it, but we have to simplify this. And the technology actually lets us simplify it by actually holding to a higher standard. And it's a lot easier for people to use. And to Todd's point, it's easier to train people as well.
There's a question that just came in the chat. It says, there have been penetration testers and virus scanners. Is there an equivalent ecosystem for individual data protection? Are there tools and services out there to detect the leak? It's different than the full-scale breach. The breach is the dam breaking, and then the trickle is the privacy leaks. What are we seeing to help, more of the individual versus the large-scale corporations?
Yeah, there is that leakage. Literally, those little trickle of privacy leaks are the phishing. Well, the vector is phishing, ransomware. I mean, those were all pressuring you to release privacy, breach your own privacy. But at least in the corporate arena, and then I can talk a little bit about the academia as well. You can do these locally as well, but I like to talk about the cloud versions, because they did start more with a clean sheet of paper, and you don't have the legacy exceptions to talk about. And there are some rapidly maturing tools to look for that needle in a pile of needles. And it's all based on not the data itself, but the aberrant behavior. Why is that person under this role at this point in time moving that amount of data, and so forth? And it's but they're actually getting pretty good at this. And in academia, it's a little harder, because you want the student body to have more freedoms, and so the detection of this is harder. But that's where things like machine learning, deep learning, pattern matching is starting to really show some benefits in cybersecurity.
Todd, were you going to jump in?
Absolutely not. I'm not a technical person, and I couldn't offer any tools. If it goes wrong, I'm there for you, but no.
Okay, I'm going to jump to the next question. As we work remotely, and are we seeing a decrease, and this is directly to have Glenn kick this off, a decrease in our large scale breaches and attacks since COVID-19, and if so, what are we attributing the decrease to? Or is it just another flavor, and we're seeing an increase in those other, approaches versus, the traditional phishing, ransomware, et cetera?
Well, there's a lot I can't say in answer to that. I would put out the challenging question. What makes anybody think that those attacks are decreasing? And to those of to my colleagues, those attacks have not diminished. They haven't really changed in type. They're kind of obscured because of the phishing and malware stuff and ransomware that's just creating kind of like chaff around it. But it's business as usual inside the corporate environment.
I was thinking though too, I wonder if that needs to be broken up a little bit as far as the attacks and things we don't know about are still going on. But it does seem to be there's a little bit of a slow in having to send out the notification letters, after the attack. Here, for example, in Illinois, we have PIPA, which is the Personal Information Protection Act, which requires if there's a breach that you have to notify the individuals in that breach a very, very certain way. And it seems, I think, perhaps I'm wrong, but even just my own mailbox is seeing fewer and fewer letters from corporations saying, hey, your information's been compromised. I know a few years ago, we were doing breach responses routinely, and we were sending out letters, hundreds of letters to people, and that slowed down a bit. So I don't know if that's attributable to the fact that businesses are getting better at it. Perhaps that's it. But I can tell you this too, our clients have changed a little bit, because back when we were seeing the Target breaches and the Chase banks or whatever it was easy to say, sorry, Michelle, Chase Bank, I should have left that one out of there. But it was easy for our clients to say, look, I'm not Target, I'm not Home Depot, I'm not at risk. And we really had to walk them back and say, look, as long as you're holding data, you're at risk. So from our point of view, not having those large scale breaches any longer has helped us be able to relate this problem to our mid to small size regional clients. So that's been good for us there.
And I'd like to just I wanted to slip in a follow-up on the US side, and then Valerie give you the point, because I think it'll be really interesting to compare US with Europe on this. We actually did see in the last 6 months that people are holding on to disclosure longer than we're used to. And my hypothesis is that it's complicated now by things like GDPR, and people are uncertain about, the companies are uncertain about their risk, saying too much, too little, and instead they're just delaying while they argue about it internally. And Valerie, I'd love to see, since GDPR has been in place longer in Europe, is this going to continue? Is there a learning curve, or will it get better again?
Well, I suppose disclosure and mandatory disclosure, which is essentially what you're talking about, which is the need to disclose a breach when you know one within 72 hours. I suppose it's that piece that we're seeing a huge amount of in Europe. And I'm sure it's the same as well. You must be seeing it in the US. You just don't have the same law that actually mandates that it must happen within those 72 hours. And the piece, which goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Glenn, about the kind of crossover between privacy and security, is that boundary has become quite blurred by GDPR, because now access, which was typically security, getting access to your information, is now one of my rights as a data subject under GDPR. Therefore, if you don't provide access to my information for one day, you've breached GDPR. So, you've breached my privacy rights, but it's access. It's not, it's typically being found in security. And so with COVID, what happened was loads of organizations suddenly started to work from home, and their voice recording systems, and that's part of my access rights. I have the right to those telephone calls. I was told that they were being recorded, and now they're not being recorded because somebody's at home and they haven't had the opportunity to move that infrastructure into the home environment. So we saw a huge number of those access requests being denied, and that led to privacy fines, but they're privacy fines for what was typically considered to be business recovery and security. So I do see that in disclosure. I'm not a lover of this mandatory disclosure, because I believe that mandatory disclosure is predicated on the horse having bolted and the damage is done. So I think that mandatory disclosure just kind of disciplines organizations into having to tell the truth when they have a breach. But really, you want to be putting something in place that discourages them from having it in the first place. And that's the piece that's missing. And it also allows organizations to qualify whether they'll take the risk or not. I mean, we saw it with Uber. Uber said, how much will we get fined? X amount. Well, then let's just keep it under our hat, you know, and let's not tell them about the breach. We'll pay the ransom guys off and we won't. So we see these things, but in Europe, mandatory disclosure, you know, it also misleads you into believing that breaches are on the increase. They're not. GDPR disclosure is on the increase because it's becoming a discipline that organizations have, but the breaches aren't on the increase. Our insight into how many breaches are out there is on the increase. So I don't know that that answers your question, but I think it kind of covers my view on mandatory disclosure anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here in Illinois, under PIPA, a data collector needs to take reasonable security measures, is the statute. And it's so nice to say, I have no idea what that is, as far as I think we're going to see, you know, so that was our attempt here in Illinois to sort of give that security before there's an actual breach, as far as did they take reasonable security measures? I don't know what that is. I guess we'll know it when we see it, but, and there's enough ambiguity there for any lawyer to really make a big day out of, I would think. So I don't know how we do it. I know we're probably inadequate here in Illinois with the way things are set up, but that's how we do it here.
What I find interesting is the crossovers. Like, because of well-intentioned legislation takes a while to really marinate well. So talking about Illinois law, it's one of, I don't know if this is still current, but I heard it was one of 2 states that where a full face image is considered PHI, personal health and private health information, personal information. What that meant is that drone manufacturer came to us, the only one that had FAA, you know, certification to make flights, and they were using it largely for crop dusting and that sort of thing. And they could accidentally catch a farmer's face, and then it gets uploaded into the cloud because the drone, you know, can't have that much local storage. And boom, now they've got a HIPAA violation when they didn't really mean to. So it's these crossovers that are really going to take a while to work our way through.
I'll keep.
So we in GDPR. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, really quick. I'll just keep it short on BIPA, which is the Biometric Information Protection Act here in Illinois, and I'll tell you, it's keeping us. We're going to be able to send our kids to college because of it. And really quick, the problem that happened was with BIPA, the biometric information, is we had all of these Kronos or these companies go in and they sold this equipment which could take the piece of a thumbprint. It's just points of data. It's not the actual thumb or fingerprint. And then it's boiled down to an algorithm, you know, and I guess it's mathematical at that point. But Kronos went in and sold it to all of these companies, these small employers, and they said, look, here's the deal. Your employees can just use the thumb or fingerprint, and it'll make things easier. So they installed it. I've heard so many times, how is this illegal? Where did this law come from? Well, BIPA's been around since 2008. It's just the technology wasn't there. And the companies that were going in and selling it were, you know, not necessarily notifying everybody that, hey, you need to comply. And really compliance with BIPA, which is biometric, it's just giving notification that, hey, we're going to take your biometric information. And so many companies out there didn't do it. They installed the equipment, and now the class action suits are just running wild here. And so that's an example, I think, of technology surpassing where the law was, and we're really feeling the effects of it right now in Illinois.
I think that's true. That technology is the issue. Is legislation and technology can never be married. So GDPR is technology agnostic, but it also does exactly what BIPA does. It says technical and organizational measures. I mean, what a day, you know. So it's a similar problem across all legislation. I don't think they'll ever be able to fix that. On the drones, we have the same problem in GDPR with the drones, and you have to just do a data protection impact assessment, which will determine that the farmer's data subject rights haven't been majorly affected, and therefore you can do it because he's an inadvertent actor. So, you know, there has to be a level of reasonableness, I think, with all legislation.
Mm-hmm. And Todd, maybe you can comment this, but I heard the CCPA revisions that are coming to the November elections in California do inject a little bit more, well, I mean, you could look at it as more restrictive, but I think there are some useful clarifications there as well. We're not at the place where GDPR is. This inadvertent stuff is not necessarily an out for us. And I think that CCPA, though, revision is a step in that right direction.
Yeah, we're definitely not where the European Union is. I still don't know if I'm jealous of the EU completely. I mean, I don't like the patchwork system that we have right now. It's nice to watch GDPR kind of work out some of the bugs, and then maybe we'll pick, you know, the system that works best for us. CCPA obviously is even experiencing some issues with COVID. I think I read that the enforcement piece of it, which was supposed to happen this summer, that deadline was pushed back even a little bit just because compliance with some of the data protocols was so difficult. So it's all over the place, and we'll see where it goes. Different types of data being gathered, you know, different laws applying, different individuals from different jurisdictions. It's tough. It's tough for data collectors out there.
So Todd, do you see a federal privacy protocol coming into existence anytime soon, or are we going to continue to sort of, you know, rely on each state sort of developing and, you know, instead of going and cherry picking the best out of GDPR and making it federal?
They're really going to have to step in and do it soon. I mean, I guess when I say soon, they've been trying to talk about the federal laws for years. And the more we see, I think, California or New York or Illinois develop their own body of law, the more difficult it's going to be to come in and create a federal system to sort of govern that as well. The other problem I think that we have with the federal government is who's going to do it. I mean, is it going to be, you know, the FTC? We can't even get a federal government agency to agree that they're going to take the lead. And I got to say hats off to Glenn, because he sent me, and we've been looking at this. So on October 1st, the Department of the Treasury stepped in and said that they're going to sanction companies that give money toward ransomware to sort of stop the ransomware from happening. You know, don't pay the ransom is the thought behind it. And when you really think about it, you have cyber insurers that definitely have stepped up and covered that risk. And they say, in the case of you experiencing ransomware, we'll pay that ransom and we'll help you with that response. Well, now all of a sudden you have the Department of the Treasury saying we're going to sanction banks or cyber insurers. You know, I read that. First off, I thought it was a little strange, but also I said, where did the Department of the Treasury come into all of this? I thought we were worried about the FTC or some other government agency. So I don't know who's going to take the lead on it. Homeland Security, I guess, too. I mean, as far as they're always involved with it. So I don't know if we're going to see, I'd love to hear everybody else in the panel, but I don't see it. I'm not preparing for it. We're going to just try to reconcile all the different state laws at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that Treasury used to own the Secret Service, and that's where they became a player in this historically. So when I was working for U.S. Bank and back when it was INS and later DHS and ICE and so forth, the various agencies governing immigration, that was all ruled by the Secret Service, which is very interesting. The Secret Service protects commerce.
Interesting.
But in terms of that patchwork you're talking about, Todd, I think your kids are safe through college, because this is part of the natural process where you get a piecework state by state, and it isn't. We've been saying, you know, CCPA this and CCPA this. There's also New York years before California had their NYDFS, which is their for financial securities, was very similar pattern after GDPR as well. And yes, I'm as uncomfortable as everybody else listening at just how many acronyms are coming out of my mouth, but you kind of get used to it over time. And you know, when that starts interfering with commerce, then the federal government steps in. So it's interesting. The state, this is a natural part of the process. We're going to have to get states continuing to put these forward and have the patchwork and the friction gets increases until frankly, major corporations are complain to the government and say we're having trouble doing business.
There's nothing worse than one of our clients saying to us, well, what's the consequence of violating BIPA, biometric? And as it stands right now, the Illinois legislature says it's $1,000 per violation. So is that the collection? Is that one violation? Is it the use of it when I scan my thumb in and scan out? If I come in the morning for work, go for a lunch break. I guess people don't take smoke breaks anymore. So go for a lunch break, come back in. Is that 4 times per day? Then are we talking $4 grand per day times X number of employees? I mean, we see a lot of mid-size corporations here in Illinois who maybe are in the fast food industry, who have tons of employees, a revolving door. They're looking at, I mean, millions and millions of dollars of potential fines. And we really don't know, as it stands, how to calculate the damages. So once again, I mean, here's Illinois, and I think a lot of states are watching Illinois with BIPA just to see how it turns out. But it's a tough road sometimes when you're out there with some of these data protection programs and trying to figure out how it works.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I can tell, because obviously I'm not in the US, but it is that GDPR was born in 2014. It was enacted in 2016 and it went live in 2018. And now we're just over 2 years into it. That's how long it takes in the EU for a piece of legislation to be created, to turn into a bill, get passed through various different pieces of legislation and legislators, and then to trickle down into each of the different countries and to be adopted by them through their legislation. It takes a long time. So even if tomorrow the government decided we want a federal privacy act, it is unlikely to be in place in a 12-month period. It would have to go through all the process that a bill has to go through. So there'd have to be a real, I suppose, want, a drive forward for that. And who would drive forward? Well, would it be a particular government? Would a certain type of government drive forward a federal privacy act? If I look at the privacy acts around the US that are coming out, CCPA, New York, they're all the liberal states, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it would be a liberal government, would be a government that might drive through a federal privacy act. I'm not saying that is the case, but I just wonder, might that be the case? That plus many, many years might result in a federal privacy act.
I think that's a great point that it'll take a while. I can say, at least in the circles that I go around in, that it's not so much liberal versus not, it's where the attorneys general see a political path to a higher office, and that tends to be New York and California, pass a draconian law of some sort and then prosecute under it. And it really, I'm not even being cynical, I don't think. I think I'm just being factual about it. And so we may find actually unlikely supporters, tech giants in Silicon Valley, who are under pressure and probable antitrust action and would love to have a federal privacy bill that could show they could salute that particular flag and not have to piecemeal be, accused of this or that and have to prove this or that. So it will take time, but we may find some interesting dynamics going on just in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
I agree. So Todd, back to you, one more question regarding regulation. So some of these regulations are calling for a DPO, a data privacy officer, or a chief privacy officer. What is your perspective on the importance of this role? Do you think it's going to muck up, how school districts and corporations deal with remote workers and learners? Do you think it'll actually simplify it? Will it give people more accountability? What's your perspective there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're really learning now is everybody's a data collector. It's not just Facebook or large corporations. So it's nice to have that pivotal person. And I think, one of the things that, we've talked about quite a bit is the fact that SOPA, which is the Student Online Privacy Act here in Illinois, which comes in force on July 1st, 2020, it sort of carves out a position for a CPO, which is useful, I think. And it's one of the things that we've been trying to get our clients to do for years. In addition to do breach response plans, which we could not sell those things at all, to finally hear somebody say, look, you need that one centralized person. So you look at it in the way that we've always approached it, and the reason I like it so much is you look at it for pre-breach. Everybody's going to have a breach, basically. Pre-breach, it's nice to have that person know what's going on in the industry, where the data is going. One of the things we see with schools is we see teachers going and getting apps for their classroom, for their students. And one classroom has this, the other classroom has that. And there's nobody in the school that really knows that that's what's going on. So if you see a breach at one of those vendors, you may have a person, if it's not centralized, not even know that their data had been given to that place where there was a breach. So, then during the breach, we love to see that centralized person because they can quarterback it a little bit. The last thing we like to see is really everybody just running around. It's nice to have that one person who knows what's going on, who needs, who do we talk to, and how do we resolve this issue. And then finally, post-breach, we like to have that one person there who can look back and sort of, think about what had happened and play that out and look at the scenarios. What could they have done better? One of the things that we really try to drive for our clients is don't fire the person that is quarterbacking the whole thing. I mean, we've had so many issues where that person gets blamed. So we need to get that blame away from the person who's responsible for it. But as a whole, pre-breach, post-breach, during the breach, it makes the process a million times better and safer in our view.
Gosh, Todd, I got a list of people I need you to talk to. They're all my board members because unfortunately it is a part of my job description that my job's on the line. The example of Uber earlier, it was, a foregone conclusion that the CISO would have to leave as part of that. So maybe in another level of maturity, that wouldn't be the case. But it is one of the hazards of the profession. The difficulties we have in Trexin is, we're a couple hundred people. We're a management consulting firm. We don't provide technology services, but we have to have a CTO, a CIO, a CDO, a CPO, and a CSO, and EIEIO, and it's hard. I think the one thing I'd want everybody in the audience to hear is that it doesn't have to be different people. Okay, different compliance frameworks require different. It's high trust for HIPAA that requires a chief privacy officer, and it's GDPR that's a chief data officer, I think. But it can be the same people. The important thing is to have, you're right, a single person accountable. That person could be switching hats if it makes sense for the company.
Got it. Makes sense.
I'm a Detroit Lions fan. I'm from Detroit, and we fire our coach all the time. We know the Detroit Lions are going to be terrible, and then we fire that person the minute the season's over. So maybe that's where I'm getting that from a little bit. So.
Well, if anybody would like to know about a great role that you can't be fired from, it's the DPO role under GDPR.
Oh, wow.
Is a data protection officer, but it's not the DPO, as you guys would know. It's not the CPO. The DPO under GDPR is appointed under certain rules. So, you have to have a certain amount of data, or you have to have a certain amount of employees, or you have to be a public sector body. So you have to appoint a DPO under certain rules. That's 40,000 extra DPOs now in Europe as a result. So we are like super busy. If you want to pay for your kids and your grandkids' college, DPO in Europe at the moment.
Oh, that's good.
But the big thing about the DPO is they're really hard to fire because they're not actually accountable. They're advisors. The board remain accountable. So the CPO will be informed by the DPO. The board remain accountable. And so if their necks are going to roll, not their necks are on the block, heads are going to roll, it's not the DPOs. And that's a great thing, but they're also really difficult to get rid of if they're bad. So, but yeah, it's protected for that very reason, that they cannot be, they need to be independent. But the board need to make sure that they get the DPO to inform them. So it's a great role to have. You have a really interesting role without all the accountability.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
Valerie, if there's an online enrollment form, would you send me the link? Yeah.
This has been great so far, you guys, guys and gals. Lots of good information, and I just want to formally open it up and encourage the audience to ask their questions. You can go into chat or raise your hand and I will unmute you. So, and I know Michelle has some more questions for the panel as well. So let's keep it moving. Anyone? Anyone? Michelle, then why don't you keep asking questions, and as they come up in the chat, I'll let you know.
Okay, that's great. So to the panel, what can we share in terms of best practices with our audience regarding remote learning and workforce? There's a lot to do being a remote person, employee, learner. There's a lot to learn if you're not tech savvy. So for example, let's be mindful and intentional about our wiring, our networking, our devices in our home and our office. We want technology to enable us, but we don't want it to, create dilemmas and openings for these hackers and ransomware folks when we're trying to connect all things. So what pieces of advice, if you would say, if you're thinking about the checklist for the remote worker and learner that they probably haven't already seen someplace, or if they have, reinforce it as a really good best practice?
Well, I'll start. It's really hard in the home environment because stuff goes on. My wife is a real estate broker, and she got this really good deal from ADT to wire our home in security. And I came home and I found there were 47 other devices now connected to the network. And who appointed me the head of the IT department at home anyway? But so therefore I try and keep it simple. And it's like what Todd was saying, it's like that human behavior, the training. It's like, okay, just look through everything you've got at home, all your laptops, everything else. I ban all local storage. It's all going to be in the cloud. It's encrypted. Everything has multi-factor passwords because I just can't control. All I can control are those few that increasingly small minority of devices that actively support our work, and just support that. So I try and just chip away at the problem, so that because otherwise you're in this continuous state of eternal vigilance. And I don't know anybody's life where their main priority is to continue to defend their homeland, their digital homeland.
Totally not mine.
I can say personally, and I'm sure we all deal with this, I mean, nobody has lived until they did an army crawl underneath their 7th grade daughter's social studies class, because it's on, and you walk in the room and you're like, oh, so we're dealing with that from a school perspective. But I joking aside, the privacy risk with the kids right now has been something that we've been struggling with, to give that access into our home, into our, all day, the kids in front of the camera, the kids, you get frustrated because you can't download something properly and you take shortcuts. That's been an issue that we've dealt with at home, and it's been very difficult. Professionally, you haven't lived until you had to appear for a motion hearing and you had to remove your cat from the room, you go off the record and actually remove your cat. So we're struggling with that as well from a law firm perspective. I got an email yesterday that said, please dress appropriate during Zoom. So I don't know what our lawyers are wearing to Zoom meetings right now. So we're dealing with that. But I think from a client perspective, really just the training, the environment has changed so much from the beginning of all of this. To be able to go and do some training, even if it's online with some of our clients, to train their staff, to sort of, look at the threats that we've seen. And then as we move back into the offices, start thinking about those threats again. So we're going to push training a lot, just HR, because one of the things I've always thought about is when we have a breach, I'm always put into contact with the HR person every time. It's the HR person, because the tech person knows they're gonna, take care of that problem, but the HR person wants to know what employee data was taken or what's happening, what's going on with this. So we're gonna focus on staff training a lot as we go into 2021.
I think there's a kind of, I suppose it'd be sociological, if that's the right word, issue that I've seen arising, which has been that I'm teaching online now because as part of my PhD, I have to teach a module. So I'm teaching a master's online. And so I've suddenly discovered a whole new host of privacy problems that I've never had in the industry world, in the world of working with industry. So online, sorry, that's Siri just kicking off. Online, it's been very interesting to see what their privacy issues are. And it's kind of back to what you were saying, Todd, which is, somebody actually needs to say to them, because I've seen my children do this as well. Maybe you shouldn't let somebody see your home. Maybe your mother will be a little bit upset if you are actually exposing your home and the washing on the line and other personal things that you don't want to be seen in their school place. They don't get the transitioning. I had a lecture, I gave a lecture yesterday, and there was a guy doing his ironing. I mean, he was listening to the lecture, but it still seemed a most peculiar thing. And I think that the online learners need, because of their age, they're mainly millennials, or they're Gen Y or Gen Y, I think, they need to understand that there's a new way of covering privacy, of protecting a level of privacy that they never had to do before. So I think they have to do that. That's one piece I think they have to do. And the other piece I think is really important, it isn't quite privacy, but it's the picture. And a lot of them don't show their picture. And in the context of online learning, it's really important to be able to gauge the cues, the human cues, for the person teaching and for the person training, and to be able to gauge the cues of the people they're actually attending class with. So to see everybody like you would in a normal work environment, you need, or a normal training environment, you need to see the picture. And I think that's an absolute mandatory requirement for any online training, is that you can see other students and you can see yourself, that the teacher or the lecturer can see you as well. And I make it a requirement for all my lectures. And some students still don't do it, and I respect that, that's their decision, but I really want it to be so that I can get cues and that they can get cues.
So I find that's interesting, Valerie, in the space of those same comments, there's a spectrum here. Because I do insist that that the cameras be on, I personally have adjusted if there's a rumpled bed in the back, or somebody in boxers going to the refrigerator for a drink. It's just part of an adjusted equilibrium point on what actually is defined by privacy. So I think we should be aware of that as we go back in the workplace, but also as this continues, let's say indefinitely, and be willing to adjust, where that needle should be. I'll give a specific example. It's I was talking to a colleague in the bank, and a bank client, international bank, significant amount of offshore, and when they went remote, the offshore, is it appropriate? I think I can appropriate. It's appropriate to identify it as India. And his gentleman said, "I just want to make sure my camera's going to be off. And so will my microphone a lot of the time because we have 4 of us in a 1-bedroom, and our apartment is 200 meters from the airport. And these were things that didn't have to be considered when they chose that living arrangement, and they were simply, working in the office 12 hours a day. But now they do. And so I felt like, and he was, my colleague was also saying that he just had to adjust his perceptions on what was acceptable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so how do you create that workplace culture outside without the workplace, sort of controls and parameters, and you got 200 square feet, because you want the engagement, you want the collaboration, you want the perks, you want all that connectedness with productivity and security, but it's tough in that specific scenario.
One thing that we've noticed, I think, at least from in our industry, is the distinctions that can be made between age. Younger people are much more open with the new environment, I think would be a generalization you could make. And you got to kind of account for that, I think, as we move back. What are people going to think? How do they want to work? Does this change the workplace in 2021? Gender, obviously. I think gender roles and having the kids at home, this is something that we've talked about before a little bit. How does that impact work? And what are those requirements that we put on folks if they do have kids at home? I work from home and I have 2 kids here. Sometimes my day is very different than it used to be when I would go to the office every day. And so that's something I think from a psychological perspective that we're going to have to think about. Well, we have all these great tools. Oh, what are they doing? Are they becoming too evasive in our lives? And things along those lines will have to be dealt with, I think, as we get back into 2021.
And that's a great lead into my last question. Thank you so much, Todd. From the human and social perspective, the pandemic's impact on us working and learning remotely has made us all much more aware and adaptable and forgiving in a lot of respects. But it's also provided some social dilemmas, isolation, independence with, maybe some downtime that you didn't really expect. So to quote a great sorry, I have a fly in here, a great cyber icon, he said, we've gone from islands of security to lily pads of vulnerability. So from a physical, cultural, social, and emotional perspective, our stress levels are higher, we're getting burned out because we're working 24 hours a day. How and what would you respond with in terms of the impact to our culture? And, I feel remote working and learning is here to stay. And so how do we address that from our personal and social responsibility perspective?
I think from a social responsibility, we all have a social responsibility when it comes to the pandemic, but the pandemic will pass, and there's going to be some carnage behind us, and there's going to be some advantages. And I think there's no way, Todd, for instance, you talk about your 2 children. There's so many people I know who have now discovered that they can have a relationship with their children that's enhanced whilst still being productive and still being able to work. And I think that anyone I've spoken to says, I don't want to go back to the way it was. So there's a reluctance now to go back. And yet organizations will most likely want people to come back. So I think there's going to be a balance post-COVID between these 2 worlds where people are going to say, I want to work 3 days from home and I want to work 2 days in the office because it'll be safe to work in the office then. But there'll be this balance requirement where employees are going to make the demand. Now, obviously in certain industries, you don't hold the power. So in those industries, it's the employer's going to say, no, you have to come back in. But for knowledge-based industries, certainly in Ireland, most employees, like in the sector that I work in data protection and cybersecurity, we have 140% employment. So thank you, GDPR. But, for those, you can just say, I actually don't want to work full time in the workspace anymore. I want to work some time from home. that didn't happen before, and I think people have a taste of it. And so they're going to be taking that with them. And I think that, you know, organizations will need to be socially responsible about that and say, we need to face up to the fact that our employees are going to want to keep this. They've been given a taste of this new world. There's some piece of it they like, there's some piece of it they don't like, but they're going to want to take some of it forward. So I think that's going to be key to sort of the organization of the future, is one that can bridge those divides. I, for one, would never like to work full-time at home. I would like to get back to the office for some of it and like to work from home for some of it.
I think one interesting data point from the technology sector is where we've had work remote and global workforces and TaskRabbit, type of bit work going on, cottage industry re-emerging. When Marissa Mayer left Google and became the CEO of Yahoo, one of her first acts was to bring everybody at Yahoo back to the office. And her point was, we have lost our competitive edge by not being face-to-face. That's one data point. When I was at ThoughtWorks, the global agile consultancy, we did some measurements, and so the survey was, when you're not face-to-face, you suffer, and this is for software developers, so it's a technology space, you lose 40% of your productivity immediately by not being face-to-face. Next door, next floor, next country, doesn't really matter. And we actually used that to our benefit by physically shipping people around from offshore to intern to build the personal relationships so that when they were stretched remotely, they could interpolate all of the rest of the social interaction. So I think everything that you say, Valerie, is correct. And I think the world, I'm going to say the world at large and overgeneralize, is now playing with what we've done decades in the technology sector. And there will be a pendulum swing one way, and then it will stabilize somewhere in the center over time.
So it also creates opportunity for us if you can use this technology and become sort of an industry leader that can help you. One of the examples we had is for Mediator. I was talking to opposing counsel a couple of weeks ago, and we have to agree on a mediator to use. That's usually an older, a former judge who will sort of bring the parties together and try to resolve the case. And we were talking, we're like, how about this mediator or that mediator? And it came up, well, he's really good at Zoom. So doing mediations now via Zoom requires you to have boxes, making sure people, can't hear if you're going to break away from your clients. So all of a sudden, maybe a mediator who wasn't that good or wasn't the first one that we would suggest is really good at Zoom. So we all want to take him. So there is a lot of opportunity out there if we can harness that a little bit.
We were talking earlier about particularly kids' privacy, and one thing that I've done, or I guess since there's a lawyer on the line, a good friend has done, is to establish internet birthdays. So from the beginning of my kids being on the internet, any anti-social media sites they sign up on, they use their internet birthday rather than their real birthday. And it's actually interesting to see then when Facebook wishes you a happy birthday on, you know who your true friends are, because they know your real birthday, and your Facebook friends know your internet birthday.
It's a great tip. Thanks, Tim. Lori, you want to go into that next question? You're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, now I'm off mute. Let me see here. I don't see another question, Michelle.
There's a Ken Miller one from.
Is there Ken? Why am I not seeing it?
Ken?
But maybe I'll just share it and then
Go for it, Glenn, because I'm not seeing it at all for some reason.
Yeah, it was about 15 minutes ago. With the expansion of drones communication needs for GPS and data transfer to the cloud, how do we protect data and privacy? And I'd like to, take that from a technology perspective and say, you know, to that extent, drones really aren't any different than smartphones. So I'm a big believer in taking the next technology development and relating it to previous ones. I won't bore you with how I explained to CEOs and the board that the internet was really like fax machines on steroids. But in this particular case, drones are a new device, but the problems are still the same, and you want to tie it into the regulatory and compliance framework that it's most similar to.
That's pretty.
Privacy perspective, I can only tell you about GDPR's approach to drones. So for instance, very recently, in fact, a week ago, in Waterford, where they make the crystal, apparently, they cancelled their, started to use drones for traffic management. Great idea. But unfortunately, they didn't do what's called a data protection impact assessment before they implemented the drones. So there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with it. But the complaint was made by a privacy advocate saying, I want access to the data protection impact assessment and none exists. So they were fined as a result of that because the risk to the data subject wasn't defined beforehand. It wasn't established, it wasn't signed off. So you cannot, you know, the concept of absolute privacy, and this is something that a lot of people, you know, they do think they have this right to absolute privacy. Privacy is not absolute. It has to be balanced with public interest. It has to be balanced with a number of different things. So it is not absolute, and the expectation to have absolute privacy is unreasonable. So there isn't any legislation that says it's absolute. But when you take a risk-based approach, you do determine what is the risk to the data subject and the data that the data subject has or it has offered for collection. And it's that piece is the most important piece for the structure of GDPR. I don't know how it works in the US because it will be depending, I'm sure, on the patchwork element of which state are you in and what are the laws about drones in that state.
I like Glenn's analogy of the phone. You know, it has a camera on it, and it's just the general rule of thumb is for our clients is we're just trying to cut liability down at any place we can cut liability. And part of that is just not causing somebody damages. So if you're going to take somebody's images, let's make sure that we don't damage them in any way. I think BIPA right now, the Biometric Information Act, would be the only place you would really see some potential liability with the drones, you know, as far as you're taking images. And BIPA seems pretty clear right now that photographs, that's not going to be considered a biometric identifier under BIPA. So you should be clear of that, but just don't do anything dumb with a smartphone or a drone, basically, would be the thought on that.
So we've reached the end of our time, our main time. And so I want to see if anyone else has one last question. Otherwise, throw it back to Michele for a wrap up. And then I'd like to just mention something about next month's Tech Talk.
So while we're waiting for any questions to come in, I guess panel, think about anything you want to leave with the audience that we haven't covered. We've had a very comprehensive discussion here before we leave the session. And if we don't have any questions in, we'll start with Glenn.
You know, it's, I'm reminded strongly of a talk I had given to, it was actually Harvard alumni, and the reason I'm mentioning it is not to do a humble brag, but to say these were smart people, smarter than I am. And at the end, one of the folks asked me what I think was intended to be a stumper and say, well, if you were to boil down this security and privacy down to just a single piece of advice, what would it be? And I guess my mouth raced ahead of my brain, and I heard myself say that just don't do anything you can't explain to your mother. And as I thought about that later, I was thinking there's a lot of truth to that. The compliance comes and goes, the regulation comes. But really, if you don't actually do anything wrong or don't do things that are not easily explainable, you're going to be safe no matter what. So I just thought I'd put that out there, and with a shout out to all the moms, and leave it
That's
at
a
that.
good one. Thank you. Valerie?
I suppose my parting comment would be my PhD is about doing privacy right, not doing privacy rights. And so we often talk about privacy where the goal is the legislation and compliance. So we talk about what does the law say we must do. And I often advocate to my clients that if we take a different approach and if we actually look and try to do privacy right, actually do right by the data, do right by the customer, you'll actually reach the legislation anyway. You know that will take you there anyway. You'll most likely exceed it. But if you take the approach of doing privacy right rather than doing privacy rights, you'll usually make the grade in terms of implementing without even knowing what the legislation is. So it's taking that attitude of just because you can doesn't mean you should. So, you know, you can do stuff because the law tells you that you can do stuff, but maybe it's going to get right up your customers' noses because maybe they didn't expect you to do that with their data. So, you know, it was all in the terms and conditions. So if we take the approach of doing privacy right, then I think we will all achieve a far better outcome for both clients and for organizations.
Thank you. Todd?
Well, the only thing I can say is, you know, the best lesson I ever learned is for some reason we adopted a greyhound, and she's a former racer, and she's really fast, and she's always trying to get out the door. And if she gets out the door, well, she's gone. You can tell I'm not going to catch her. So the thought around the household right now is she only needs to get out that door once, and we need to be on the defense every time. And she's better at it than we are. And so, you know, the four of us in this house have to work together and make sure she doesn't get out the door, make sure the door is being shut properly, the wind doesn't blow it open. And so really, I think the panel tonight sort of demonstrates that too, is we can all work together and, you know, make sure, because the cards are really stacked against data collectors to protect that information. So that's the approach, is the Greyhound approach that we have. And we use that for our clients as well.
I love it. So coined. Well, it's been an honor, and I'm very thankful to the audience, our panelists, Valerie, Todd, and Glenn, and Hub 88 this afternoon for allowing us to share our perspectives, and hopefully the audience has some actionable nuggets to take away and start implementing. So stay well, be safe, and keep cybersecurity and privacy front and center all the time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
just so everyone knows, this is recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel, usually within 48 hours. So make sure and visit that if there was something in particular that you wanted to revisit. And then for next month, I'm excited to say our Tech Talk is on same, you know, Wednesday. Let me look just to make sure I say the right date. So yes, Wednesday, November 11th, 5 o'clock. And we are doing what I'm calling Building Our Future, Technology and one of the oldest professions, the construction industry. So what's happening in tech and construction? It's, we just to mention, we're still building the panel, but the moderator is Brenna Berman. Brenna Berman was the Chief Information Officer for the City of Chicago under Rahm Emanuel, and now has her own nonprofit called City Tech, and they help cities use technology to be more sustainable and on and on and on. So super interesting stuff, and really looking forward to seeing what is happening. It's just fascinating. Of course, I find it all fascinating. So make sure you come next month, put it on your calendars, and keep telling people about Hub 88. We're doing some fun things, cool things, interesting things, and we've got a lot of different areas where you can participate. And there's also, if you check the calendar, events for kids coming up for the younger kids, innovation and entrepreneurship. So look into that as well. And again, thank you all for attending and participating. And thank you to the panelists.
Thanks, everyone.
Peace out.
Take care.